Hi, my name is Jared and this is Horror Obsession. Today, I want to talk about Stranger Things Season 1. Stranger Things is one of the most popular shows out right now and is wrapping up with Season 5 coming out next year. I fell in love with the show almost right away, in part because I love any horror where the main cast is kids, sort of like Super 8 or Summer of 84, so it makes sense that I would love this show. It seems like the show is nearly universally loved, however, so what is it about Stranger Things that has such wide appeal? It is going to be impossible to talk about this show without spoilers, so if you have somehow not seen this show yet, at least give it a chance. It's pretty great, and at minimum, worth checking out to see if you fall in love with it too. Alright, so the main reason I think this show is so beloved is the characters. Anytime a show reaches the massive cultural impact of Stranger Things, it probably has a wide range of likable characters. I feel like this is the fundamental reason the show is so good, namely the characters are all very realistically written and their actions are well motivated. What I mean by this is the characters make decisions for reasons that make sense, and that have been established previously in the show. There are three main mysteries in this season, notably what happened to Will, who is 11, and what is the monster. There are three main groups of characters: Joyce and Hopper, Mike, Lucas, Dustin, 11, and Jonathan, Nancy, Steve. And all of these groups actively engage the mystery, which turns out to be all kind of the same mystery. But before we talk about that, I wanted to talk about what makes these characters all so great. Let's start with Hopper, who begins as kind of a jaded, sarcastic sheriff who gets dragged unwittingly out of his coffee and donuts routine by Joyce's frantic worry about Will. We don't find out until later, but Hopper's daughter died of cancer. Hopper had to sit by while she withered away from that horrible disease, and because he could not save her, he is extremely motivated to try and save Will. He overhears an old dude from the diner talking about seeing a little boy and he thinks it might be Will, so of course he goes to check it out. His motivation to start the search for Will goes beyond his job and has personal stakes attached to it. Hopper is looking for Will and ends up finding out about 11 by following up on the old dude's tip, but his involvement starts with him searching for Will, serving as a chance at redemption for the death of his daughter. Amazing motivation right there. Another example of proper character motivation is Joyce, who gets pulled into the mystery because she is trying to find Will and keeps having the weird light phenomenon happen in her house, and she can literally hear his voice talking to her through the phone. So the reason she is involved makes perfect sense. A mother searching for her missing child is one of the easiest to understand motivations on Earth, and I doubt anyone would question that her character is properly motivated, even when she starts taking more and more drastic action as the season goes along. So let's talk about the main cast of kids, the heart and soul of the show. The main cast of boys is very likable, and they are all very different, which is important to establish realism. After all, people in real life are typically quite different. This is where Stranger Things really shines as a TV show, because we get to have a lot of moments with the kids, getting to know them and to root for them. The only one who is not very fleshed out in Season 1 is Will, because he's kidnapped in the Upside Down the entire season. But Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and 11 are all very well written. Mike is set up as being the leader of the group, deeply compassionate and wanting to save Will, though he gets kind of distracted and pulled into a love story with 11. Dustin is a bit more of the tech nerd kid, constantly explaining things to the other boys such as how compasses or magnetic fields work. Lucas is the brave one, willing to fight and lead the way in terms of actively taking action towards accomplishing their goals. He is also the most suspicious of 11, and towards the end of the season, he becomes the one who is the driving force behind trying to find Will. The characters get even better as the seasons go along, but Season 1 establishes these characters as being realistic, interesting, and most importantly, active protagonists, who are always pushing the narrative forward with their actions exactly how it should be. Too many shows and movies have their main characters drifting aimlessly through their stories, more passive participants than protagonists, and Stranger Things avoids that entirely. Nancy is a typical teenage girl, focused on her relationship with her boyfriend and navigating the fact his friends are kinda douchey, and trying to decide what kind of person she wants to be. Is she the girl who parties on weekdays?
Party? Ding, ding, ding. It's Tuesday.
Tuesday, oh my. Come on.
Or is the kind that studies all the time and gets good grades?
I'm fine. This isn't you. I'm fine. Just go ahead and go home, okay?
Searching for your identity as a teenager is one of the most relatable character journeys possible, but the Duffers hit us with a curveball and also have Nancy end up being kind of a badass and being the one to wield the gun and join Jonathan on his violent quest, but we'll get to that in a second. Steve is extremely well written in season 1 also. His character was supposedly intended to just be an asshole bully, but the Duffers liked Joe Keery so much that they rewrote the character to make him more likable, and boy did it work. He goes through a very interesting and believable journey, starting as the popular jock asshole, which culminates with him breaking Jonathan's camera. Even this is well written because honestly, I kinda get where he's coming from. Jonathan was taking pictures of him and his girlfriend through his window from his backyard. That's some weird stalker shit right there. Breaking the camera is a bit much, but he redeems himself by the end of the season, giving Jonathan another camera and having his arc come full circle. See what I mean about the great writing? I did want to highlight something about the main group of characters, which once again is Nancy, Steve, Jonathan as the teenager group, Hopper and Joyce as the adults, and Mike, 11, Dustin, and Lucas as the kids group. Joyce and Hopper are focusing on finding Will, and for them, that is the main mystery of the season. The kids group starts out trying to find Will, but they quickly find 11, and they focus both on finding Will and on exploring 11's checkered past. The teenagers are trying to find Will at first, but once the dead body is found, Jonathan thinks Will is dead, and so they end up focusing on trying to kill the Demogorgon. On the surface, all of these characters are working on different mysteries, but their stories interweave and they find out at the end that they're all really working the same mystery. This connecting of the different subplots into the main story is the reason the writing in Stranger Things is so masterful. The characters also all meaningfully contribute to the success of the climax of the story, so let's talk about how they do that. The teenagers realizing they can lure the monster in with blood, and they're trapping it with a bear trap and then burning it with fire, weakens it for the climax, so their contribution is clear and important. They gain this knowledge in small pieces throughout the show, which pays off wonderfully in the end, giving the earlier story beats more weight because everything adds up and pays off. Hopper and Joyce figure out about 11 through their investigation and know she is Jane Ives, and suspecting Brenner and the scientist people is what leads them to the lab in the first place. Hopper makes a deal with Brenner to go get Will from the Upside Down, and in exchange, they give up the kid's location. But the result is they go into the Upside Down, and they are the ones to save Will. The primary thrust of the entire narrative, so their contribution is, once again, extremely clear and important. For the kids, they discover about the Upside Down from D&D and from their teacher, and obviously 11 is the one who kills the Demogorgon at the end, so their contribution is clear and important. Every character impacts the story in a meaningful way, and seeing all of these characters' storylines converge in the end, and them sharing the information they have learned, and watching the puzzle pieces fall into place is so satisfying. I think that is the major reason the show is so beloved, besides the characters being so well written in the first place. I actually have even more to say about the characters, so let's talk more about Nancy and Jonathan and Steve's character arc and storyline. I normally kind of hate love triangles, but this one is very well written and the focus of their narrative oscillates back and forth between the love triangle and the investigation, so neither one ever feels stale. The Duffers are such good writers that they have a way of integrating the main mystery of the story in with the characterization. The two main storylines at work are Nancy and Steve and Jonathan having their high school love triangle drama, and Nancy and Jonathan investigating the disappearance of Will and finding out about the Demogorgon. This storyline is the strongest example of excellent writing that defines the show, and just this story alone puts most entire TV seasons to shame. There is minimal coincidence, and the actions of the characters drive the story forward in a satisfying way. Switching back and forth could feel jarring and unwarranted, but there is always a good reason one scene leads into the next. So let's take a look at what I mean by this, starting with Jonathan. He is looking for his little brother, Will, so obviously his actions are well motivated. He goes to the spot where they found Will's bike and he is searching through the woods, and he brought his camera with him in case he needs it to take pictures as evidence. Perfectly logical reason to be in the woods and to have his camera. He then sees Nancy and Steve at the pool party and ends up creepily taking pictures of them, which is a pretty weird creeper thing to do and is kind of unmotivated. But ultimately, this is characterization for Jonathan, and to be fair, the Duffers understand this and he gets called out for it later. Jonathan is not intended to be some perfect boy without flaws who's a victim of his circumstances. He is a bit of a weird loner who is largely responsible for creating his own trouble. Nancy is at the party because she likes Steve, so she's motivated. After Barb goes missing, however, she gets pulled into the main mystery. Both Nancy and Jonathan are searching for a missing person that was taken by the monster, so it makes sense for them to team up, especially after they both see the monster in the background of the photos Jonathan took. Jonathan already heard his mother's description of the monster, so when he sees the monster in the photos, they both believe that it is real, which is a smart way of having Nancy and Jonathan get deeper into the story. I think normally if someone saw what they did in the photos, they would just brush it off, but having Joyce describe it to them is enough to have it make sense, which sets them off on their journey to kill the Demogorgon. Along the way, Steve enters the story again, and after seeing Jonathan sleeping in Nancy's room, feels betrayed, and his idiot friends write the slander about Nancy on the movie theater. They get into the fight, which is important because this is the catalyst of Steve's redemption arc. He realizes he's being an asshole and helps clean up the paint, then goes to Jonathan's house to apologize. However, that is when they are luring the Demogorgon in with blood, so he ends up being pulled into the climactic fight on accident. You can see how the Duffers weaved in the love triangle story and how the love drama pushed the story forward while at the same time dragging characters into the main mystery. This kind of writing is extremely difficult to do and should never be taken for granted. There are so many characters in Stranger Things that without this level of writing mastery, this show could easily devolve into a jumbled mess. So what does Stranger Things have going for it besides great characters? There is an amazing atmosphere, which is accomplished a few ways. I like the fact that they set the show in the 80s, but that has been talked about ceaselessly by others, so instead, what I wanted to talk about was how the Duffers established stakes for the characters involved. If you are going to put the characters in your show in danger, it helps to build the tension if the audience legitimately believes the characters might die. The best way to accomplish this is to actually show some characters die, so the show starts off with the scientist getting eaten from the elevator. From the very first scene, the horror has been established and the audience knows this is a dangerous world. Killing Benny in the second episode continues to set the tone for the series. Benny is a really nice guy and he gets a lot of screen time with Eleven. We are led to believe he is going to be a major character and perhaps even the father figure for Eleven. When they unceremoniously kill him, it is quite shocking. Considering the main cast is kids, it is important to let everyone know what kind of a show this is going to be and to be prepared for some violence, which ratchets up the suspense for all future scenes with the monster and the government scientist folks. The Duffers are so good at using events like this to both set the tone for the series as being darker than your typical children's story, and to also integrate those events into the narrative of the show. In this case, Benny's death serves to increase the tension, but also Hopper is looking into the disappearance of Will and hears about the little boy that they saw at the diner from that old dude at the police station. So he thinks it might be Will, and this puts him on the trail to 11, sparking his entire storyline in season 1. Great writing, Duffer dudes. Another example of an early death setting the dark tone of the show is Barb, who also is set up as potentially being a major character before getting killed in episode 2, which in combination with Benny's death and the elevator scientist at the beginning, really emphasizes the potential danger of the monster. She didn't wander off alone in the woods or go looking for trouble, she was just sitting in Steve's backyard and gets snatched by the monster there. Most horror uses death to send a message to the audience. For example, in slashers, it is very common that if the characters have sex, they're gonna die.
Now you gotta die. Those are the rules.
The message, of course, being that having premarital sex is bad. Stranger Things doesn't really have Barb do anything immoral. She is just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, which in many ways is even more effective for being scary because now any of the characters we like could be in danger at any time. And let's talk about some other aspects of the show I like, starting with the acting. The acting is really good, especially considering the age of the cast. The kids all put on pretty good performances and are certainly believable as kids. This is in large part due to the aforementioned good writing, but poor acting could have still sunk the show. The kids are more than up to the task and do a great job. Winona Ryder is a standout for me in season 1. She is a little bit one note and acting kind of hysterical and crazy for almost every scene, but then again, her youngest son has been kidnapped by a monster from another dimension, so I get it. She does a good job stepping back and toning it down when necessary. For example, one of my favorite scenes is when Eleven is getting ready to go into the sensory deprivation pool. She sits her down in a very motherly way and basically says, "We will be right here to guide you and keep you safe, and if you ever want to stop, Just let us know. This helps humanize the characters and creates a sharp contrast between Joyce and Brenner and the scientists, who only want to use 11 for her powers. Without this scene from Joyce, the audience might get the impression they are only trying to use 11 for her powers too. However, this is clearly not the case. Winona really sells this scene, and it goes to show she has more range than Hysterical Mother. I also really like the music, and the Duffers clearly wanted to capture the 80s atmosphere, and this would have been very difficult without the right music. When I think of 80s, I mostly think of John Carpenter synth music, and apparently the Duffer dudes do too. The music is very reminiscent of that, and it creates an atmosphere of foreboding, where the surface of things might look one way, but lurking under the surface, an indescribable evil is growing. In real life, this manifested in the form of the Red Scare, where Americans thought communists were infiltrating their quiet suburban lives, which comes up a lot more in future seasons, but in Hawkins, the threat is a lot more direct. There is literally a monster, and the ominous music collaborates with the early deaths mentioned earlier to set the perfect tone. As far as themes, many late 70s and early 80s horror movies like Halloween dared to ask the question of whether the suburban version of Americana was a good thing. And Halloween ends with static shots of the suburban environment Laurie lived in, suggesting a killer could be lurking around any corner. Stranger Things has themes like this as well. In fact, Nancy and Jonathan explicitly discuss whether the suburban lifestyle is a good thing, in a classic way, by discussing why they don't want to be like their parents. Nancy's mother is described as settling for Ted, who is a bit boring, but stable.
My mom was young. My dad was older, but he had a cushy job.
Nancy, quit it, I'm talking. Jonathan represents the more counterculture perspective, listening to rock music and just being a bit of a loner. He critiques Nancy and her perfect suburban lifestyle for being superficial and fake. Thematically, Stranger Things is only good, not great, but when you have such great characters and writing, honestly the themes are not as important. There is a bit more to it than critiquing suburban America, however. The show also takes a look at grief, which makes sense considering the inciting incident is a little boy going missing. This is explored primarily through Jonathan and Joyce, not one of the primary groups for the subplot, but they start out together before splintering off later. Jonathan is taking the stance of moving on and admitting Will is dead. After all, they literally found his body in the quarry. We, the audience, know it is fake, but considering Jonathan as a character does not know they are in a supernatural TV show, why wouldn't he think Will is dead? This also explains why his main motivation by the end of the season is to try and kill the Demogorgon. He's looking for the monster and not his brother because he believes his brother died. Joyce is holding on to hope despite all the evidence being against her and essentially represents the side of faith.
Crazy, maybe I'm out of my mind, but God help me, I will keep these lights up until the day I die if I think there's a chance that Will's still out there.
Jonathan doesn't believe he will ever see his brother again and is advocating for the pragmatic perspective of moving on and preparing for the funeral.
Yeah, well, while you're talking to the lights, the rest of us are having a funeral for Will. I'm not letting him sit in that freezer another day.
Joyce represents the religious perspective of holding on to hope no matter what, and she is rewarded for her faith as she does eventually save her son. What I really like about this story is the fact both Jonathan and Joyce deeply love Will, and they are expressing that love in different ways. Neither one of them is really right or wrong. They are struggling with their grief and trying to find something to hold on to which helps them navigate the suffocating darkness of losing a family member. Finally, the theme of trauma is explored through 11. She was stolen from her mother and experimented on by Brenner, and we learn a lot more about this in later seasons, but let's focus just on what we know from season 1. 11 follows a trope I kind of hate, which is having a character start out mutant naive. Oh, what is baby Gandalf doing here? Get back to your own show, you little turd. And then these communication difficulties the character have drive a lot of the story forward because for some reason they can't just tell the other characters what is going on. This makes even less sense after what we know from season 4, since 11 was talking to people pretty much all her life and has plenty of social interactions with people besides Papa, but whatever. So 11 is basically mute and uses hand gestures and stuff to communicate, a clear sign of child suffering from abuse. Benny picks up on this right away and calls CPS, thinking she might have been abused, and to be fair, he was totally right. I even think 11's nose bleeding when she uses her powers is intended to be a visual metaphor for her abuse. It kind of looks like someone hit her. I can say there is some deep message or understanding of abuse presented by the Duffers, and the way they tie this into other themes is essentially by showing the government as being this evil, all-powerful entity. Brenner has his entire team of agents, including the lady who shoots Benny at the beginning after posing as a social worker. Brenner tries the same trick on Ted and Karen later, only for them to be more skeptical and not falling for it. One of the best written and most interesting things in Season 1 is the way Brenner's team operates. They gather information about a situation and then try to manipulate the people involved to giving them the information they need. The theme being explored here is a general distrust of authority and of institutions, showing that these institutions have ulterior motives and do not have your best interests in mind. 11 is being used by the institution as a weapon of war, and is not even a person, but just a tool, depicted by the fact she doesn't have a name, just a number. She is a victim of the Cold War mentality that the Russians must be stopped at all costs, including the cost of abducting and torturing children. This distrust in the government is thoroughly explored through Hopper as well, as he does eventually betray 11 to try to save Will. Hopper is both an agent inside the system, he is a cop after all, but more fundamentally he is a local Hawkins boy who grew up to become a cop. He is on the side of the people of Hawkins first and foremost, which includes Will, but does not include 11. This changes in future seasons, but we see his obsessive drive to save Will being perfectly tied into the death of his daughter who he could not save. So the actions he takes in service of this goal are exceptionally well motivated. In some ways, he is the best written character in the entire season, and I might have said that a few times, which is a perfect encapsulation of how well written this show is. Overall, Stranger Things Season 1 is a brilliant masterclass of writing. The characters are so perfect, being both extremely likable and realistic. There isn't much more to writing characters than that, but while simple, it is very difficult to actually do. Stranger Things succeeds in this regard for the entire main cast, which is astonishing. They weave in the main mysteries of the story with the interpersonal drama, culminating with a satisfying conclusion that ties all the storylines together and gives all the characters something important to contribute. Along the way, they explore themes of grief, trauma, the dehumanization of people by government institutions, and exploring the impact of the suburban life might be having on the youth of America. I think the exploration of theme is a little light in Stranger Things, but the character stuff is so great and the central mystery is so strong that it hardly matters. I really love this show and think it will age very well. This show is up there for me among the very best TV has to offer and is extremely rewatchable, which helps. Stranger Things does almost everything right and is just about the perfect fantasy horror TV show, especially for someone with a strange, horror obsession.